Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a race that knows no fear, feels no remorse, and lives for nothing beyond the pure joy of violence. They are the greenskins, the orcs, a fungal plague upon the galaxy that spreads like wildfire across countless worlds. Among their savage hordes rise leaders of terrible power, bosses who tower above their kin, who accumulate scars and trophies like other beings collect years. But what happens when one of these brutal tyrants survives not just battles, not just campaigns, but centuries of unending warfare? What becomes of an orc warboss who lives too long? To understand this question, we must first grasp a fundamental truth about orcoid biology, one that sets them apart from virtually every other intelligent species in the galaxy. Orcs do not simply age, they do not grow old and frail, their bodies betraying them as the years accumulate. Instead, they grow, and they grow, and they continue growing, year after year, battle after battle, for as long as they survive. There is no natural endpoint to this process, no genetic switch that flips to signal the end of development. An orc who manages to avoid death in combat will become larger, stronger, and more dangerous with each passing solar cycle. This perpetual growth is not merely a biological curiosity. It is the very foundation of orc society, the mechanism by which their entire social hierarchy functions. In the brutal meritocracy of the greenskins, might quite literally makes right. The biggest orc in any gathering is automatically recognized as the boss, and any orc who grows large enough to challenge that boss will inevitably do so. Victory in such challenges leads to even more growth, creating a feedback loop that can, under the right circumstances, produce truly colossal specimens of orcoid development. The average orc boy, freshly emerged from the fungal spores that birth his kind, stands perhaps 5 to 6 feet tall. He is already stronger than a grown human man, his muscles dense and powerful, his green skin thick enough to turn aside blades that would slice through human flesh. But he is nothing compared to what he might become. As he fights and survives, as he earns the respect of his fellows through acts of violence and displays of strength, his body responds. Hormones surge through his bloodstream, triggered by the psychic gestalt field that all orcs generate collectively. His muscles swell, his bones thicken, his tusks lengthen. Within a year of constant combat, that boy might grow to 7 feet. Within 5 years, 8. This is how knobs are made, those brutal enforcers who stand head and shoulders above the common boys. A knob might measure 9 or 10 feet in height, his arms as thick as a man's torso, his fists capable of pulping skulls with casual blows. He wears the best armor his warband can provide, wields the finest weapons, and commands through a combination of natural authority and frequent beatings. But even a knob is small compared to what comes next. A warboss represents the pinnacle of common orc development. These towering monsters stand anywhere from 10 to 12 feet tall, some even larger. Their bulk is tremendous, wider at the shoulder than a space marine in full power armor. Their strength is such that they can tear apart vehicles with their bare hands, rip the turrets from tanks, and crush lesser beings like insects. They wear heavy mega armor, mount power claws on their arms, and bristle with weapons that would require a team of humans to carry. And yet, even a warboss is not the limit of what an orc can become. History records specimens far larger, far more dangerous, far more intelligent than any common warboss. These ancient tyrants, bosses who have survived not decades but centuries of warfare, grow to such tremendous size that they approach the proportions of war machines. They stand as tall as buildings, wear armor thick enough to turn aside tank shells, and possess a cunning that belies the brutish reputation of their species. These are the warbosses who live too long, and they represent one of the most terrifying threats the galaxy has ever known. The story of what happens when a warboss survives for too long is not merely a tale of physical transformation, though that aspect is spectacular enough. It is also a story of psychological evolution, of tactical genius emerging from savage instinct, of the potential that lies dormant within orc genetics, waiting for the right circumstances to awaken. It is a story that has repeated itself throughout galactic history, from the war in heaven 60 million years ago to the battles raging across the Imperium today. And it is a story that continues, with new chapters being written even now as ancient bosses gather their strength and cast their eyes toward new conquests. The biology of infinite growth. To truly comprehend the transformation that overtakes an ancient warboss, we must delve deeper into the bizarre and fascinating biology that defines the orcoid species. Orcs are not, in any conventional sense, animals. They are, at their core, a symbiotic fusion of animal and fungal tissue, a hybrid organism that combines the strengths of both kingdoms of life, while eliminating many of the weaknesses that plague more conventional species. The animal component of an orc provides mobility, cognition, and the capacity for violence. It gives them their muscular frame, their aggressive instincts, their ability to learn through experience. But it is the fungal component that truly sets them apart, embedded within their cells, woven through their very flesh, are countless fungal organisms that perform functions no animal tissue could manage alone. These fungi process nutrients with ruthless efficiency, repair damage at an accelerated rate, and perhaps most importantly, eliminate the need for complex internal organs that might become points of failure. An orc's internal anatomy is remarkably simple compared to a human's. They possess robust organs that are difficult to damage and redundant systems that ensure continued function even when grievously wounded. Their thick green skin is not merely armor, but a living solar panel, for orcs possess the ability to photosynthesize. The chlorophyll in their blood allows them to convert sunlight into energy, reducing their need for constant food intake and making them terrifyingly self-sufficient. An orc warband can survive in environments that would starve any human army, drawing sustenance from the very sun itself. This photosynthetic capability has profound implications for orc warfare. Supply lines, the bane of every conventional military force, are far less critical to greenskins. They need ammunition, certainly, and fuel for their vehicles, but they do not require the constant flow of food that human armies demand. An orc can fight for days without eating, sustained by sunlight and his own metabolic reserves, only requiring a good meal of squig meat or fungus when the battle finally ends. This makes them extraordinarily difficult to defeat through siege or attrition, for they can endure hardships that would break lesser species. But it is their regenerative capabilities that truly boggle the mind. Orcs possess a healing factor that borders on the supernatural. Wounds that would kill a human outright merely inconvenience an orc. They have been observed regrowing severed limbs, given sufficient time and resources, their fungal tissues slowly reconstructing damaged body parts through processes that magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus struggle to fully understand. Even decapitation is not always fatal, as orc painboys have successfully reattached heads hours after separation, the patient surviving and often growing larger from the experience. This extraordinary resilience has a direct connection to their perpetual growth. Each time an orc survives a serious injury, each time he overcomes a dangerous foe, each time he proves his toughness to his fellows, his body responds. The psychic gestalt field that all orcs generate collectively, sometimes called the green aura, intensifies around successful individuals. This field, born from the collective belief and recognition of other orcs, acts as a growth hormone. The more respect an orc commands, the larger he grows. The larger he grows, the more respect he commands. It is a feedback loop written into their very genetics, a biological imperative that ensures the strongest and most successful orcs rise to positions of leadership. This process is not instantaneous. An orc does not simply balloon in size overnight. Rather, growth occurs gradually, accelerating during periods of intense combat and slowing during quiet times. A particularly successful campaign might see a warboss add several inches to his height and dozens of pounds to his frame, and years of constant warfare can produce dramatic transformations, turning a merely large orc into a towering giant. Decades of survival push them beyond the norms of their species. And centuries, those rare instances where a boss survives for generations of lesser orcs, produce specimens that defy conventional categories entirely. The fungal aspect of orc biology plays another crucial role in their perpetual growth through their reproductive system, if it can even be called that. Orcs do not reproduce through conventional means. Instead, they constantly release spores from their skin, microscopic fungal cells that drift on planetary winds and settle into soil. These spores lie dormant, often for years, slowly growing into underground fungal networks. From these networks emerge first the smallest orcoid life forms, the tiny snotlings that tend to fungal gardens, then the larger Gretchen, who serve as slaves and labor, and finally the orcs themselves, who emerge fully formed and ready for violence. This means that an ancient warboss, who has spent decades or centuries moving from battlefield to battlefield, has seeded countless worlds with orcoid spores. Even his presence on a planet for a brief time ensures that orcs will plague that world for generations to come. The older and larger a boss becomes, the more spores he releases, creating a trail of future invasions wherever he travels. In this way, an ancient boss does not merely threaten the present, but poisons the future, ensuring that his kind will continue to spread long after his own death. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of orcoid biology in relation to their perpetual growth is the apparent absence of any genetic limit to their size. In conventional species, there exist biological constraints that prevent organisms from growing beyond certain parameters. Skeletal structures cannot support weights beyond a certain point. Hearts cannot pump blood through bodies that exceed certain dimensions. Metabolic processes break down when scaled too large. Yet orcs seem to bypass these limitations entirely. Their fungal component compensates for the weaknesses of their animal aspect, providing structural support that normal bone cannot, enhancing circulatory function beyond what a conventional heart could manage, and optimizing metabolism in ways that defy standard biological models. Imperial scholars who have studied orcoid physiology theorize that this unlimited growth potential is not an accident of evolution, but rather a designed feature. The orcs, or rather their ancient precursors, the Krork, were created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven as living weapons. Every aspect of their biology was engineered for warfare, optimized for survival and violence in the most extreme conditions imaginable. The perpetual growth mechanism was likely intended to ensure that successful warriors became ever more powerful, creating natural champions who could face the mightiest enemies the Old Ones encountered. This design feature has profound implications for understanding what happens when a warboss lives too long. Each year of survival pushes them further along a developmental path that was meant to produce specimens capable of contending with primarchs, greater demons, and the war machines of ancient empires. The average orc never lives long enough to fully realize this potential, cut down in battle long before reaching their maximum size. But those rare individuals who do survive, who prove cunning enough to avoid death and strong enough to crush all challengers, they begin to approach the original design specifications of the Krork. The body of an ancient warboss is a masterpiece of biological engineering, every system optimized for warfare, every cell dedicated to the singular purpose of survival through violence. Their bones are denser than ceramite, their muscles stronger than bundled steel cables, their reflexes faster than most would credit to such massive frames. They heal from wounds that would cripple lesser beings, shrug off toxins that would kill humans instantly, and can function for extended periods without sleep, food, or water. They are, in every measurable sense, superior warriors to virtually any natural organism in the galaxy, and they continue to grow, year after year, battle after battle, with no apparent endpoint to the process. This is what makes ancient warbosses so terrifying. They are not merely large orcs. They are orcs who have been allowed to develop along the full trajectory their genetics permit, approaching the ultimate form their species was designed to achieve. They are living proof that the orcs, despite their apparent savagery and simplicity, are perhaps the most successful warrior species the galaxy has ever known. The psychological transformation. The physical changes that overtake a warboss as he ages are spectacular and obvious. But the mental and psychological transformations that accompany this growth are equally dramatic, if less immediately apparent. Orcs have a reputation throughout the galaxy as simple, brutish creatures who think only of violence and possess minimal intelligence. This reputation is not entirely undeserved when applied to the average orc boy, whose mental processes rarely extend beyond find enemy, hit enemy, take enemy stuff. But this characterization becomes increasingly inaccurate as one ascends the orcoid hierarchy, and it is entirely wrong when applied to the ancient bosses who have survived for decades or centuries. An orc's brain, like the rest of his body, grows throughout his life. But it is not merely size that changes. The very structure and function of the orcoid mind evolves as they age and accumulate experience. Young orc boys possess a kind of baseline cunning, an instinctive understanding of violence, and a genetically encoded knowledge of basic orcish technology. They know how to swing a chopper, fire a shooter, and recognize who is in charge. But their capacity for long-term planning, strategic thinking, or complex problem-solving is minimal at best. This begins to change as an orc grows and rises through the ranks. As he becomes a nob, as he commands his own mob and must coordinate their actions during battle, his brain develops new neural pathways. He learns, not from books or instruction, for orcs have little use for such things, but from experience. He discovers through trial and error which tactics work and which get his boys killed. He develops an intuitive grasp of battlefield dynamics, of when to charge and when to hold back, of how to exploit enemy weaknesses and protect his own flanks. His thinking, while still primarily focused on violence, becomes more sophisticated, more nuanced, more effective. By the time an orc becomes a full warboss, his mental capabilities have evolved considerably from those of a mere boy. A successful warboss must manage hundreds or thousands of orcs, each with their own aggressive tendencies and desires to prove themselves. He must prevent them from killing each other unnecessarily while directing their violence toward productive targets. He must negotiate with or dominate other warbosses to build larger alliances. He must plan campaigns, coordinate logistics to whatever extent orcs engage in such activities, and make strategic decisions that will determine the success or failure of his entire tribe. This requires a form of intelligence that many outside observers fail to recognize as such because it does not resemble human intelligence. Orc cunning is practical, intuitive, and deeply rooted in their violent nature. A warboss does not sit in a command center studying maps and making calculations. He feels the flow of battle in his bones, instinctively knows where to apply pressure, recognizes opportunities for exploitation with the certainty of predatory instinct. His intelligence is not academic, but visceral, not learned, but evolved through countless life or death situations. But this is still merely the beginning of the psychological transformation that overtakes the truly ancient bosses. As a warboss survives decade after decade, as he accumulates not just victories but entire campaigns, as he sees the patterns of warfare repeat across multiple worlds and conflicts, something remarkable happens. His brain continues to develop. Neural pathways that remain dormant in younger, shorter-lived orcs begin to activate. Genetic programming, designed for exactly this circumstance, starts to express itself. The warboss becomes genuinely intelligent in ways that would be recognizable even to humans. This intelligence manifests in several distinct ways. First, ancient warbosses begin to demonstrate true strategic thinking. The ability to plan campaigns not just in terms of immediate battles, but in terms of long-term objectives. They can coordinate multiple war fronts simultaneously, maintain supply lines across star systems, and manipulate other orc factions to serve their purposes. They develop a form of political cunning, understanding how to maintain their position not merely through brute force, but through a combination of strength, reputation, and calculated displays of power. Second, they develop adaptability that younger orcs lack. Where a young warboss might charge headlong into the same mistake repeatedly, an ancient boss learns from experience. He remembers the tactics that worked against Space Marines and modifies them when facing Imperial Guard. He recalls which enemy commanders were cautious and which were aggressive, and he adjusts his approach accordingly. He develops counter-strategies for different enemy types, understanding at a deep level how various forces fight and how best to defeat them. Third, and perhaps most remarkably, ancient warbosses begin to display something that could almost be called wisdom. They develop an understanding of their own nature and the nature of other orcs. They know how to inspire their followers, how to channel orcish aggression in productive directions, how to prevent the constant infighting that plagues smaller warbands from tearing apart their own forces. They become students of war, not just in the immediate tactical sense, but in the broader strategic and even philosophical sense. The most ancient and successful warbosses even begin to develop the capacity for abstract thought. They ponder questions beyond "how do I win this fight?" and start considering "how do I unite all orcs?" or "how do I ensure my tribe survives for generations?" They develop something approaching ambition in the human sense, not merely the desire for the next fight, but genuine long-term goals that extend beyond their immediate circumstances. They begin to see themselves not just as warriors, but as leaders of their species, champions chosen by their gods for a greater purpose. This psychological evolution is closely tied to the psychic nature of orcoid society. The gestalt field that all orcs generate collectively grows stronger as they gather in larger numbers. An ancient warboss, at the center of a massive green tide numbering in the millions, becomes a focal point for this psychic energy. The collective belief of his followers, their recognition of his strength and authority, feeds back into his own mind, enhancing his cognitive capabilities beyond what biology alone could produce. He becomes, in a sense, more than just an individual. He becomes the living embodiment of orcish power and potential. This has been observed most dramatically in what Imperial scholars call prime orcs, specimens who represent the apex of orcoid development. These rare individuals display intellectual capabilities that shock even hardened Imperial commanders who think they understand the orc threat. Prime orcs can speak fluent Gothic, understand complex Imperial politics, grasp strategic concepts that require abstract thinking, and demonstrate a level of cunning that surpasses many human commanders. They are not merely large and strong, but genuinely intelligent, their minds having evolved along with their bodies to approach the cognitive capabilities their genetic ancestors, the Krork, possessed during the war in heaven. The psychological transformation also affects how ancient warbosses perceive and relate to other species. Younger orcs view non-orcs primarily as targets or obstacles, things to be killed or enslaved with little differentiation. But ancient bosses develop a more nuanced understanding. They learn to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of different species, to exploit their psychological vulnerabilities, even to appreciate their capabilities as warriors. A truly ancient warboss might develop something approaching respect for particularly stubborn or skilled enemies. Not friendship, certainly, but a form of professional recognition that acknowledges worthy opposition. This does not make them any less dangerous. If anything, the combination of orcish physical superiority with genuine intelligence and strategic thinking makes ancient warbosses far more threatening than younger, more impulsive leaders. A young warboss might charge into an obvious trap, while an ancient one will recognize it for what it is, and either avoid it or deliberately trigger it as part of a larger counter-strategy. A young boss might waste his forces in a direct assault, while an ancient one will maneuver and feint, using his troops efficiently to achieve maximum effect with minimum loss. Perhaps most disturbing from the perspective of the Imperium and other galactic powers is that this psychological evolution appears to be accelerating in certain individuals. Warbosses, like Gazgkul Thraka, demonstrate levels of cunning and strategic thinking that suggest their minds are developing faster than their bodies, as if some genetic switch has been flipped ahead of schedule. These bosses represent a terrifying possibility that the full potential of the Krork might be accessible to modern orcs under the right circumstances, that the savage greenskins might be capable of evolving back into the brilliant and terrible warrior savants their ancestors were designed to be. The mental transformation that accompanies the physical growth of an ancient warboss is not merely an interesting biological curiosity. It is a critical threat assessment factor. An orc is a dangerous opponent. A warboss is a significant threat. But an ancient warboss who has survived long enough to fully develop both physical and mental capabilities, who combines the strength of his massive frame with genuine tactical and strategic intelligence, who can think abstractly and plan for the long term while still channeling the primal violence of his species. Such a being represents one of the most dangerous individuals in the entire galaxy. The Imperium has faced such beings before. They required the attention of Primarchs to defeat. They threatened terror itself, and they may yet rise again, for the conditions that create ancient warbosses, prolonged warfare on a massive scale, abundant enemies to fight, and the gathering of millions of orcs into single concentrated forces, exist throughout the galaxy today in greater measure than perhaps any time since the war in heaven itself. Physical evolution, from boy to monster. The journey from a freshly spawned orc boy to an ancient warboss of terrible power is marked by physical transformations so dramatic that the two stages barely seem like the same species. This metamorphosis unfolds gradually over years and decades, each battle and victory adding inches to height, pounds to muscle mass, and thickness to bone structure. To fully appreciate what an ancient warboss becomes, we must trace this developmental path from its humble beginnings through each stage of orcish growth. A newly emerged orc boy stands roughly 5 to 6 feet tall, though his hunched posture and powerful build make him appear stockier than a human of equivalent height. His skin is thick and green, his muscles already dense and powerful by human standards, his jaw prominent and studded with tusks that will grow throughout his life. He is born with genetically encoded knowledge of violence, understanding instinctively how to fight, how to build crude weapons, and how to recognize the hierarchy of orc society. But he is small, relatively weak by orcish standards, and possesses minimal status within his tribe. This boy's first battles are the most dangerous period of his existence. He lacks the experience of his elders, the quality war gear that might protect him, and the reputation that would make others hesitate to challenge him. Many orc boys die within their first few months, cut down in battle, or killed by larger orcs in disputes over food, weapons, or simply for fun. But those who survive begin to grow, their bodies responding to the combination of combat experience, wounds survived, and the psychic recognition of their peers. After a year of constant fighting, a successful boy might reach 6.5 to 7 feet in height. His muscles have thickened considerably, his tusks have grown more prominent, and his skin has toughened further from accumulated scars. He has learned which enemies are dangerous and which can be easily overwhelmed, developed a personal fighting style that plays to his strengths, and accumulated a collection of weapons and trophies stripped from defeated foes. More importantly, he has begun to earn the respect of other orcs through displays of strength and violence, and this respect feeds back into his biology, triggering additional growth. The transition from boy to knob represents the first major threshold in an orc's development. To become a knob, An orc must dominate his peers through a combination of size, strength, cunning, and sheer aggression. He must be able to beat any other boy in his mob into submission, must demonstrate leadership through successful violence, and must accumulate enough wealth and weaponry to look the part of a leader. This typically occurs after several years of successful fighting, though particularly gifted or lucky individuals might achieve nob status more quickly. A nob stands 8 to 10 feet tall, his massive frame easily distinguishable from the smaller boys he commands. His arms are thick as tree trunks, his chest broad enough that 3 men could stand abreast between his shoulders, his legs like pillars of corded muscle. He wears heavy armor, often ornately decorated with clan symbols and trophies, and wields weapons that would require 2 human soldiers to carry. His voice, when he bellows commands or challenges, can be heard across battlefields over the din of combat. He is a terrifying figure, capable of tearing armored soldiers apart with his bare hands and inspiring fear in all but the most stalwart enemies. But even this impressive specimen is dwarfed by what comes next. The leap from nob to warboss requires not just additional growth, but a fundamental transformation in capability and authority. A warboss must be able to dominate all nobs in his tribe, must possess the cunning to maintain his position against constant challenges, and must demonstrate the strategic acumen to lead his forces to victory rather than merely charge into battle alongside them. Most nobs never make this transition, content with their station or killed by more ambitious rivals before they can grow large enough to challenge the existing boss.
You know, one of the things that fascinates me most about this whole concept is how terrifying it actually is when you stop and think about it. We're so used to seeing orcs as comic relief in the lore, the funny green guys who just want a good scrap. But the idea that they're actually a devolved version of something far more dangerous, and that they can slowly remember what they used to be just by surviving long enough, that's genuinely horrifying. It's like if every ant in your house had the dormant potential to become a lion, and all they needed was time and enough fights with the other ants. The Imperium is fighting an enemy that literally gets smarter and stronger the longer they fail to eliminate them. That is a nightmare scenario. Anyways, back to the story.
Those who do achieve warboss status typically measure 10 to 12 feet in height, though some grow larger still. Their bodies are mountains of muscle and scar tissue, their strength sufficient to flip tanks, tear blast doors from their hinges, and crush Space Marines in power armor like aluminum cans. They bristle with weapons, mega-armored plates thick enough to turn aside tank shells, power claws capable of shearing through any material, and an assortment of guns, grenades, and close combat weapons that would outfit an entire human squad. Their very presence is overwhelming, a combination of physical mass, psychic pressure from the Gestalt field, and the aura of violence that surrounds any being who has killed thousands with his own hands. A typical warboss might lead a tribe of thousands or tens of thousands of orcs. He represents the apex of common orcoid development, the standard peak that most bosses reach before they are inevitably killed by a rival, defeated in battle, or simply run out of enemies to fight and watch their tribe fragment. Under normal circumstances, an orc reaches warboss size within 10 to 20 years of constant warfare, and few survive more than another decade or two at that level before meeting a violent end. But what happens when a warboss does not die? What occurs when circumstances allow him to continue fighting, to keep winning, to survive decade after decade in the most hostile environment imaginable? The answer is a transformation that pushes orcoid physiology to its absolute limits and perhaps beyond them. After 30 or 40 years as a warboss, a particularly successful individual might reach 14 or 15 feet in height. His frame has broadened to match his increased height, making him as wide as he is tall at the shoulders. His mega armor has been replaced or extensively modified multiple times, now custom built by the finest mechs in his tribe, incorporating technology looted from defeated enemies and adjusted to accommodate his ever-increasing size. His power claw might be the size of a rhino transport, his shooters large enough to mount on Imperial vehicles. His tusks extend several feet from his jaw, sharp enough and thick enough to be used as weapons in themselves, This is where most of the galaxy's understanding of Warboss size stops, as few bosses survive long enough to grow beyond this point. But Imperial records document specimens who have far exceeded even these impressive dimensions. Warbosses who have survived 50, 60, or 70 years at the apex of their species begin to approach sizes previously thought impossible. They might stand 18 to 20 feet tall, their bulk so tremendous that they must brace themselves differently to avoid sinking into soft ground, their weight measured in tons rather than hundreds of pounds. At this stage, the physical transformations begin to qualitatively change the nature of the Warboss. Their size alone makes them effectively immune to most conventional weapons. Small arms fire bounces harmlessly off their natural hide, even without armor. Anti-personnel explosives might tear lesser orcs apart, but only annoy these giants. Even heavy weapons, lascannons and missile launchers, struggle to penetrate the combination of their natural toughness, their layered armor, and the psychic field that surrounds them. They become walking fortresses, mobile siege engines that can absorb punishment that would destroy vehicles. Their strength at this stage defies conventional measurement. They can tear the turrets off battle tanks with their bare hands, crush Astartes' dreadnoughts in their claws, and demolish fortified positions through simple brute force. Buildings crumble under their assault. Defensive lines break at their approach. Armies rout when they appear on the battlefield, the psychological impact of their presence as devastating as their physical capabilities. But the truly ancient warbosses, those rare specimens who survive a century or more, transcend even these categories. These beings approach or exceed the size of Imperial knights, standing 30 feet tall or more. They wear armor that is less gear and more mobile fortress, powered by captured generators and bristling with enough firepower to level city blocks. Their weapons are no longer handheld tools, but integrated war machines, built into their armor and frames, making the distinction between the orc and his equipment increasingly difficult to determine. The most extreme examples of ancient warbosses documented in Imperial records are the prime orcs encountered during the War of the Beast. These specimens stood as tall as hab blocks, towering over even the largest orcs like adults over children. One prime orc was described as wielding a power mace the size of a space marine. Another had an arm equipped with 2 battle cannons, along with autocannons, missile launchers, flamers, and other weapons, more firepower in a single limb than some Imperial Guard companies possess. These beings were so massive that they were initially mistaken for war machines rather than living creatures. At such sizes, the Warboss has effectively become a hybrid of organism and vehicle. Their armor is no longer something they wear, but something they inhabit, a walking platform that supports their tremendous weight and houses the weapon systems they employ. They require specialized transport to move between battlefields, often commanding space hulks or purpose-built war machines just to carry their mass from world to world. They can no longer easily interact with normal-sized orcs, their very presence potentially dangerous to their own troops, simply due to their size and weight. Yet for all their tremendousness, these ancient bosses remain fundamentally orcish in nature. They have not become sedentary or immobile despite their size. Their reflexes, while slower than a boy's, remain dangerous. Their strength continues to grow proportionally with their mass, ensuring they can move and fight effectively, even at colossal size. And perhaps most importantly, their biological systems continue to function efficiently, despite the massive scaling required. The fungal component of their physiology compensating for limitations that would cripple any purely animal organism at such dimensions. The physical journey from boy to ancient warboss represents perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any life form in the galaxy, rivaling even the metamorphosis of tyrannid bioforms or the augmentation of space marines. It demonstrates the terrible potential locked within orcoid genetics, potential that rarely manifests fully, but that, when circumstances permit, can produce living weapons capable of threatening entire star systems single-handedly. The Beast, a case study in ancient power. To truly understand what an ancient warboss can become, we must examine the most spectacular and terrifying example in recorded Imperial history, the being known as the Beast. This singular entity, or more accurately, this collection of entities, represents the apex of what modern orcs can achieve when allowed to develop fully. The War of the Beast, which erupted in the mid-32nd millennium and threatened to destroy the Imperium itself, provides a cautionary tale about the danger of underestimating the greenskin threat and the catastrophic consequences of allowing orc society to consolidate and develop unchecked. The war began in the year 544 of the 32nd millennium, roughly 1500 standard years after the Emperor and Horus had crushed the previous Orc Empire on Ullanor during the Great Crusade. The Imperium, still recovering from the wounds of the Horus heresy, but enjoying relative stability, had grown complacent. Orc incursions were treated as manageable threats, nuisances to be dealt with by planetary defense forces and the occasional space marine intervention. What emerged from the galactic fringe shattered this complacency and very nearly ended mankind's dominion over the stars. The first reports spoke of an Orc war leader of unprecedented scale and capability. Intercepted communications referred to him in terms that roughly translated to Beast, I am slaughter, or Lord who will bring great slaughter. The Orcs themselves used a phrase that would only later be recognized as a corruption of the name that would haunt the Imperium for generations, Mag Uruk Thraka, or in simplified form, Great Slaughter. This was not merely another warboss leading another green tide. This was something entirely different, something that recalled the terrible might of the ancient Krork. When Imperial forces finally encountered the Beast directly, the reports seemed impossible. The being was described as the size of a hab block, a residential building several stories tall. Imperial soldiers who witnessed him thought at first they were looking at a statue or a war machine, unable to comprehend that the towering figure was a living creature. When it moved, when it spoke, the realization of what they faced drove some to madness on the spot. This was an orc grown to such tremendous size that it dwarfed even the mighty Space Marine dreadnoughts, making the noblest orcs look like children in comparison. The beast's physical size was matched by his intellectual capabilities, which proved even more shocking to Imperial commanders accustomed to brutish greenskins. He spoke perfect High Gothic, the formal language of the Imperium's ruling class, something no orc in living memory had demonstrated. His mastery of the language was not merely functional, but sophisticated, allowing him to engage in diplomatic exchanges with the High Lords of Terror themselves. He understood Imperial politics, recognized the internal tensions within humanity's government, and exploited these divisions with a cunning that would have impressed Machiavellian philosophers. His strategic acumen proved equally formidable. The Beast coordinated multiple invasion fronts simultaneously across vast distances, maintained supply lines spanning dozens of star systems, and deployed tactics that demonstrated abstract strategic thinking far beyond typical orc warfare. He did not simply mass his forces and charge at the enemy as younger bosses might. Instead, he maneuvered, feinted, and applied pressure at weak points while protecting his own flanks. He built fortifications, established logistics networks, and created an infrastructure that allowed his empire to sustain itself rather than simply burning through resources in a brief orgy of violence. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Beast was the revelation that came as the war progressed. The single entity Imperial forces had been fighting was not, in fact, a single orc. Rather, the Beast was a collection of 6 prime orcs, each commanding what amounted to an orc legion consisting of millions of greenskins. These 6 beings were all of comparable size and capability, each one a match for the mightiest war leaders humanity could field. They coordinated their efforts, supported each other's operations, and functioned as a cohesive command structure in a way that orcs were not supposed to be capable of achieving. The prime orc most frequently encountered by Imperial forces, dubbed the Beast of Beasts by those who recognized the presence of multiple such entities, stood at least 10 meters tall when not in his armor, and significantly larger when encased in the massive battle plate his mechs had constructed. This armor was not merely protective, but a mobile weapons platform, bristling with enough firepower to level fortifications and equipped with power generation sufficient to run a small factory. One arm alone mounted 2 full-sized battle cannons, weapons normally found on super-heavy tanks, along with autocannons, missile launchers, flamers, and other weapon systems. His other arm wielded a vibro mace as tall as a space marine, a weapon that could reduce Astartes in power armor to paste with a single blow. The technological sophistication demonstrated by the beast's forces shocked Mechanicus observers. These were not crude orc war machines, cobbled together from scrap. They were sophisticated pieces of engineering that, while still distinctly orcish in aesthetic, displayed an understanding of advanced principles that modern orcs were not supposed to possess. The orcs created attack moons, planetoid-sized weapons platforms equipped with gravitational weapons capable of dragging entire planets out of their orbits. They built teleportation systems that could transport entire armies across star systems. They constructed fortifications on Ullanor Prime that rivaled anything the Imperium had built during the Great Crusade. When the Primarch Vulcan, one of the Emperor's immortal gene-sons, thought lost during the heresy, confronted the beast directly, the battle that ensued tested the limits of what a Primarch could endure. Vulcan, a being of near godlike power who had survived destruction that would annihilate continents, found himself matched against a foe of comparable might. The beast fought with a combination of brute strength that exceeded even a Primarch's massive frame and tactical cunning that exploited every opening. The duel culminated with Vulcan tackling the beast into the power core of a temple-sized war machine, detonating it in a blast that seemed to obliterate both combatants. The psychic shockwave of the beast's apparent death rippled across Ullanor, disabling lesser orcs and seeming to end the threat. But the beast survived even this. He appeared later over Terror itself, his presence announced by an orc chant broadcasting across all Imperial frequencies. "I am slaughter! I am slaughter! I am slaughter!" The Imperium was forced to mount multiple invasions of Ullanor, each time believing they had killed the beast, only to discover another prime orc taking his place. It became clear that these 6 beings were not merely leaders, but represented a return to the ancient Krork template, specimens who had developed so fully that they approached the capabilities of the race's original design. The war eventually ended with the destruction of all 6 beasts and the devastation of Ullanor Prime, but at terrible cost. Multiple Space Marine chapters were reduced to a handful of survivors or destroyed entirely. The Imperial Fists chapter, one of the original first founding legions, was effectively annihilated. Their gene seeds scattered among successor chapters to rebuild what had been lost. Billions of Imperial citizens died. Entire sectors were depopulated. The orcs were driven back, but the Imperium paid in blood and treasure on a scale not seen since the heresy itself. The lessons of the War of the Beast were clear, but have been largely forgotten or ignored in the 10,000 years since. First, orcs allowed to consolidate and develop over long periods can approach or exceed the capabilities of the ancient Krork. Second, the physical size of a warboss directly correlates with his intellectual and strategic capabilities, making ancient bosses exponentially more dangerous than young ones. Third, the genetic potential of the orcoid species is far greater than commonly assumed, and under the right circumstances, modern orcs can effectively devolve back into their more powerful ancestral form. The beast proved that an ancient warboss is not merely a large orc, but potentially a being capable of threatening the greatest powers in the galaxy. His mere existence and the fact that multiple such beings arose simultaneously demonstrated that the process which creates prime orcs is replicable and might occur again under similar conditions. This is perhaps the most frightening implication of the War of the Beast, that it was not an anomaly, but a preview of what Orc society can produce when given sufficient time, resources, and enemies to fight against. In the aftermath of the war, the Imperium established the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition and the Death Watch chapter, specifically to prevent another beast from arising. These organizations were tasked with monitoring Orc activity throughout the galaxy and intervening before another beast-level threat could develop. Yet 10,000 years later, with the Imperium stretched thin across a galaxy beset by threats on all sides, one must ask whether these measures remain sufficient. The conditions that created the beast, massive wars, prolonged conflicts, and the gathering of millions of Orcs in single locations, exist throughout the galaxy today in greater measure than perhaps any time since. The next beast may already be growing, adding inches and cunning with each passing year, waiting for the moment when he will unite the green tide and unleash it against an unprepared galaxy once more. Gazgkul Thraka, the modern prophet. If the beast represents the ancient history of what an Orc warboss can become, then Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka represents the present danger and future nightmare. This contemporary warboss, whose name echoes the ancient beast's own title, has spent decades growing in power, size, and influence. He is widely regarded as the most dangerous Orc currently active in the galaxy, and many Imperial strategos believe he represents the single greatest green-skinned threat since the War of the Beast itself. The story of Gazkul's rise and continued survival provides a modern case study in what happens when a warboss lives too long. Gazgkul's origins are, by Orcish standards, remarkably well documented. 9 standard years before his first invasion of Armageddon, he was a lowly Orc boy in the armies of Warboss Dregmek on the world of Urk. There was nothing particularly special about young Gazgkul at this time. He was simply one among thousands of boys, fighting and killing and growing like any other member of his species. His transformation from anonymous warrior to prophetic warlord began with a wound that would have killed any human, and indeed did kill most of his brain. During a battle against automated defenses left behind by Dark Angel's Space Marines, a bolter round struck Gazgkul directly in the head. The mass reactive shell exploded inside his skull, destroying roughly 30% of it and pulping a significant portion of his brain. By all rights, he should have died instantly. But Orcish biology is remarkably resistant to trauma, and Gazgkul survived long enough for his tribe's pain boy, the infamous Mad Doc Grotznik, to find him and drag him back for treatment. Grotznik's solution to Gazgkul's catastrophic head wound was characteristically Orcish in its brutal simplicity. He sawed off what remained of the damaged portions of skull and replaced them with adamantium plates, creating a crude cybernetic reconstruction that covered roughly 1/3 of Gazgkul's head. The surgery was conducted without anesthetic, using tools that would make human physicians weep, and employed techniques that violated every principle of proper medical care. Yet it worked after a fashion. Gazgkul survived, though he remained in a coma for an extended period while his body recovered. What emerged from that coma was fundamentally different from what had entered it. Gazgkul claimed that during his period of unconsciousness, he received visions from Gork and Mork, the twin gods of the Orc pantheon. These visions told him that Orcs were meant to conquer the galaxy, that they had grown weak and divided, and that he was chosen to unite them and lead them to ultimate victory. Whether these visions were genuine divine communication, hallucinations born of brain damage, or something else entirely, their effect was undeniable. Gazkul awoke convinced of his prophetic destiny and possessed of a clarity of purpose that few Orcs ever demonstrate. More significantly, the injury and subsequent surgery seemed to trigger accelerated development in Gazgkul's remaining brain tissue. Imperial observers speculate that the trauma and reconstruction activated dormant genetic sequences, perhaps unlocking capabilities that normally remain latent in most orcs. Whatever the cause, Gazg-Kul began to demonstrate strategic thinking and tactical acumen far beyond what a relatively young orc should possess. He understood not just immediate combat, but long-term planning, not just winning battles, but building the infrastructure necessary to sustain prolonged campaigns. Gazg-Kul's rise through the ranks of Urk's orc society was meteoric. He challenged and defeated his immediate boss, demonstrating sufficient cunning and strength to dominate orcs much larger than himself. He then systematically conquered or allied with the other warbosses of Urk, bringing the entire planet under his control through a combination of strategic marriages of convenience and brutal applications of force. By the time he left Urk to begin his great campaign, he commanded millions of orcs and had constructed a coherent strategy for galactic conquest. His first major campaign targeted the hive world of Armageddon, a massively populated and strategically vital world in the Segmentum Solar. The Second War for Armageddon, as it came to be known, demonstrated Gazg-Kul's growing capabilities as both a warrior and a leader. He did not simply land his forces and charge at the nearest target. Instead, he systematically captured key strategic locations, disrupted Imperial supply lines, and applied pressure to multiple points simultaneously, forcing his enemies to spread their forces thin. His campaign came dangerously close to success, halted only by the intervention of 3 Space Marine chapters and the tactical brilliance of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. That first Armageddon campaign occurred in the year 941 of the 41st Millennium. At that time, Gazg-Kul was already impressively large by orc standards, standing tall enough that human observers initially mistook him for an Astartes dreadnought. But he has continued to grow in the decades since. Each battle, each campaign, each year of survival has added to his size and capabilities. Current Imperial intelligence estimates put his height at approaching 20 feet, though these reports are difficult to verify and may underestimate his true dimensions. More disturbing than his physical growth is the continued evolution of his mental capabilities. Gazg-Kul demonstrates strategic thinking that rivals the finest human commanders. He understands logistics, appreciates the importance of supply lines, and can coordinate forces across multiple star systems simultaneously. He employs deception and misdirection in his campaigns. He has been observed deliberately losing battles to lure enemies into overextending themselves, then counterattacking with overwhelming force at vulnerable points. He adapts his tactics based on which enemy he faces, fighting differently against Space Marines than against Imperial Guard, adjusting his approach based on experience and analysis. Perhaps most tellingly, Gazg-Kul has begun to display characteristics that closely parallel those of the beast. He speaks fluent Gothic, though he rarely bothers to do so. He has established a form of government on his controlled worlds that maintains order and productivity between campaigns. He has built an infrastructure capable of producing weapons and equipment on a massive scale. He has cultivated relationships with orc mechs, whose technological innovations rival anything produced by their ancestors. In short, he is building not merely a green tide, but an orc empire capable of sustained war-making on a galactic scale. His second invasion of Armageddon, launched 57 years after the first, demonstrated his continued growth and development. This time, he arrived with even larger forces, better equipped and more organized than before. The Third War for Armageddon dragged on for years, consuming resources on both sides at an apocalyptic rate. Billions died in the fighting. Entire continents were reduced to wastelands. The war drew in forces from across the Imperium, becoming one of the largest sustained conflicts of the 41st millennium. But Gazg-Kul eventually grew bored with the stalemate developing on Armageddon. Rather than remain locked in a war of attrition, he departed, leaving his subordinates to continue the fight while he pursued what he perceived as greater opportunities. This decision alone demonstrates the difference between Gazg-Kul and typical orc warbosses. A younger boss might have remained on Armageddon until killed or victorious, unable to conceptualize abandoning a good fight. Gazgakul, however, understood that Armageddon was ultimately a distraction from his larger goal of uniting all orcs and leading them to galactic conquest. Since leaving Armageddon, Gazkul has traveled throughout the galaxy, appearing at various war zones and rallying local orc forces to his banner. He intervened in the Octarius War, where orcs had been locked in combat with Tyranids for decades. His arrival reinvigorated the orc side of that conflict, and after slaying a mighty Morlock bio-creature, he reorganized the local forces and departed once more, leaving them stronger and more unified than he found them. Current Imperial intelligence suggests he now commands an armada of approximately 5 million warships, making his fleet one of the largest orc forces ever assembled. What makes Gazkul particularly dangerous is not merely his current size and capabilities, but his trajectory. He is still growing, still learning, still accumulating followers and resources. Every year that passes without his death sees him become larger, smarter, and more dangerous. His growth curve suggests that if he survives another few decades, he might approach the size and capability of a prime orc. If he survives a century, he could become another beast, a threat capable of bringing the Imperium to its knees. The parallels between Gazkul and the beast are too numerous to ignore. Both suffered head injuries that seemed to trigger accelerated development. Both demonstrated intelligence far beyond typical orc standards. Both built empires rather than merely leading raids. Both spoke fluent Gothic. Both commanded forces numbered in the millions. And most troublingly, both bore versions of the same name, Mag Uruk Thraka, the ancient phrase meaning great slaughter. Whether this is coincidence, genetic memory, or something more mysterious, remains unknown. But the implication is clear. Gazkul may be following the same developmental path the beast once walked. Imperial authorities treat Gazkul as the single greatest orc threat currently active in the galaxy. The Ordo Xenos maintains dedicated task forces focused solely on tracking his movements and disrupting his operations. Several Space Marine chapters have sworn oaths to hunt him down and end his threat permanently. Commissar Yarrick, the aged warrior who has opposed him for decades, continues to pursue him across the stars despite his advanced years. Yet Gazkul survives, and with each year of survival, he grows more formidable. The question facing the Imperium is not whether Gazkul will continue to grow and develop. That much is certain given his continued survival. The question is whether he can be stopped before he reaches his full potential, before he becomes what the beast was, before he unites the scattered orc tribes across the entire galaxy into a single, unified green tide that could sweep away all opposition. Time is not on humanity's side in this race. Every battle Gazkul survives makes him stronger. Every year he lives brings him closer to becoming an unstoppable force. He is the living example of what happens when an orc warboss lives too long, and his story is far from over. Ancient warbosses. Throughout history, while the Beast and Gazkul Thraka represent the most famous and well-documented examples of ancient warbosses, they are far from unique in galactic history. Throughout the millennia since mankind first encountered the Greenskin menace, numerous other examples of extraordinarily long-lived and powerful orc leaders have emerged, each demonstrating in their own way the terrible potential that unfolds when a warboss survives long enough to reach his full development. Examining these historical examples reveals patterns in how such beings arise, how they operate, and ultimately how they are defeated or diminished. One of the earliest documented cases in Imperial records is Urlak Urg, the warlord of Ulanor, who commanded the massive orc empire encountered by the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Little is known about Urlak's origins, or how long he had been in power before the Imperium discovered his domain, but the scale of his empire suggests decades or centuries of consolidation. He ruled an empire spanning at least 12 star systems, commanded millions of orcs, and had constructed fortifications and infrastructure on Ulanor that impressed even the Emperor himself. The battle to defeat Urlak required the personal attention of the Emperor and the Primarch Horus, along with multiple Space Marine legions, demonstrating the magnitude of threat an ancient warboss can pose. Centuries later, but still in the distant past from the perspective of the 41st millennium, rose Warlord Snagrod of Sharadon. This ancient boss commanded one of the most persistent Orc empires in galactic history, the Sharadon domain, which has proven remarkably resistant to Imperial efforts to eliminate it. Snagrod's forces invaded the world of Rinnsworld, home of the Crimson Fist's Space Marine chapter, in one of the most devastating Orc assaults ever recorded against a Space Marine stronghold. The battle saw the Crimson Fists reduced to a fraction of their strength, their fortress monastery destroyed, and their chapter nearly eliminated. Though Snagrod was eventually killed, his empire survived and continues to threaten Imperial space millennia later. In more recent history, the Overfiend of Octarius represents another example of an ancient warboss, whose longevity has allowed him to build and maintain a substantial empire. The Octarius domain is one of the largest Orc empires currently active in the galaxy, and its ruler has maintained control through decades of constant warfare. The current or recent Overfiend, Blacktooth, commanded forces during the Octarius War against Hive Fleet Leviathan, demonstrating tactical acumen sufficient to hold his own against one of the galaxy's most adaptive and dangerous species. The fact that Orc forces in Octarius have survived years of combat against Tyranids, a foe that consumes and adapts to its enemies with terrifying efficiency, speaks to the capability of the warboss commanding them. Warlord Nazdreg Ugg Erdgrub deserves special mention as an example of an ancient warboss whose cunning perhaps exceeds even his physical prowess. Nazdreg commands from a space hulk called the Scylla, which his mechs have somehow managed to gain partial control over, allowing him to maneuver it in ways that space hulks should not be capable of. Imperial reports indicate he speaks fluent Low Gothic and demonstrates levels of resourcefulness unusual even for warbosses. He employs both punishment and reward to control his forces, a degree of psychological sophistication that most Orcs never develop. He has repeatedly outmaneuvered Imperial forces sent to destroy him and maintains sufficient respect to be considered an ally, or at least not an enemy, by Gazkul Thraka himself. The great despot of Dregruk commands another of the galaxy's major Orc empires, currently locked in perpetual warfare with the neighboring Orc empire of Gathrog. The fact that these two empires have been fighting each other for decades without either collapsing suggests that both their leaders possess sufficient cunning to maintain infrastructure and force cohesion even while engaged in constant warfare. Imperial strategists worry that if these two empires ever united, the resulting force could threaten the Cadian Gate, one of the most strategically vital regions in Imperial space. Worldkiller Tuskagrob led a massive snakebite horde into the Sigma Ulstari region during the Octarius War. This ancient warboss demonstrated remarkable size and strength, requiring the personal intervention of High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars chapter to defeat him. The description of their battle suggests Worldkiller had grown to tremendous proportions, capable of matching a Space Marine's enhanced physiology blow for blow, despite the significant size difference that typically gives Astartes an advantage over individual Orcs. His defeat required Helbrecht to employ both a combi melter at point-blank range and the Marshal's mastercrafted sword driven through the skull, demonstrating the resilience such ancient bosses develop. Clawjaw, the founder of the Orc Empire of Bork, represents an interesting case study because records document his transformation from a relatively ordinary Orc to an ancient warboss of terrible power. Originally known simply as Cog, he was a primitive thug on the Orc-held side of a contested world. Something changed after he ate a mutated squig while hunting. Whether this was genuine mutation or simply triggered latent genetic potential remains unclear. But when he returned to his tribe, he had grown tremendously and wore rusted metal armor that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. He proceeded to conquer his world and expand his domain across a large portion of the Ghoul stars and the galactic fringe, building an empire that persists to the present day. These examples, and dozens of others documented in Imperial archives, reveal several consistent patterns. First, ancient warbosses invariably build empires rather than leading simple raids or migrations. The strategic thinking that develops with age naturally leads them to consolidate control over resources and territory, establishing domains that can sustain prolonged warfare. Second, they demonstrate technological sophistication beyond typical orc standards, either through personal innovation or by gathering the most talented mechs under their command. Third, they often speak Imperial Gothic or other non-orcish languages, suggesting that language acquisition is a natural result of the mental development that accompanies physical growth. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, ancient warbosses prove extraordinarily difficult to kill. Their size and strength make them dangerous opponents even for space marines. Their intelligence allows them to avoid obvious traps and recognize when discretion might serve better than valor. Their reputation and the psychic gestalt field surrounding them make them resilient to psychological attacks and resistant to morale failures. Defeating such a boss typically requires either tremendous force, skilled champions willing to face them in single combat, or both simultaneously. The historical record also reveals that the death of an ancient warboss does not necessarily end the threat his empire poses. Unlike younger bosses, whose tribes fragment immediately upon their death, ancient bosses often leave behind infrastructure and organizational structures that can persist for years or decades. The Sharadon Empire survived Snagrod's death. The Orc Empire of Bork outlived Clorjol. These domains continue to produce orcs, build weapons, and launch invasions long after their founders have been slain, testament to the lasting impact a single ancient warboss can have on galactic history. The frequency with which such bosses arise appears to be increasing in recent millennia. Whether this is due to better Imperial record-keeping, an actual increase in the survival rate of orc leaders, or the result of intensifying warfare creating more opportunities for orcs to grow and develop, remains debated among Imperial scholars. What is clear is that the galaxy faces more ancient warboss-level threats currently than at any time since the War of the Beast. This proliferation of dangerous orc leaders suggests that the conditions favorable to their development, large-scale warfare, abundant enemies, and insufficient Imperial resources to eliminate them early, have become endemic across the galaxy. The lesson from history is clear, but often ignored. Ancient warbosses represent threats comparable to demon princes, tyrannid hive ships, and other galactic-level dangers. They require prompt identification and overwhelming response to eliminate before they reach their full potential. Yet the Imperium, stretched thin across a galaxy beset by enemies on all fronts, often lacks the resources to mount such responses until it is too late. The result is a proliferation of orc empires commanded by ancient bosses who continue to grow, continue to learn, and continue to pose ever-escalating threats to humanity's already precarious hold on the stars, the threat to the galaxy. An ancient warboss who has survived for decades or centuries does not merely represent a larger, tougher version of a younger boss. The transformation is qualitative as well as quantitative, fundamentally altering the nature of the threat such beings pose to the galaxy at large. Understanding the full scope of this threat requires examining not just their personal combat capabilities, but their impact on orc society, their strategic acumen, and their potential to fundamentally alter the balance of power across entire sectors, or even the galaxy as a whole. The most obvious and immediate threat comes from their personal combat capabilities. An ancient warboss is effectively a living siege engine, capable of destroying fortifications, annihilating armored formations, and killing hundreds or thousands of enemies through direct action. Their size alone makes them immune to most conventional weapons. Infantry's small arms cannot penetrate their hide even without armor. heavy bolters and autocannons that would shred lesser orcs merely annoy these giants. Even anti-tank weapons like lascannons and missile launchers struggle to inflict meaningful damage, their shots absorbed by layers of mega armor, natural toughness, and the psychic field that surrounds all sufficiently large orcs. Their strength makes them dangerous to any vehicle or structure. They can flip battle tanks with their bare hands, tear fortified doors from their hinges, and bring down buildings through simple application of brute force. Their power claws can shear through any material, making them capable of dismantling even super heavy armor. When they engage in personal combat, they do so with a combination of overwhelming force and surprising speed for their size, striking with sufficient power to pulverize Space Marines in power armor and quick enough reflexes to intercept incoming attacks. But the personal combat threat, spectacular though it is, represents only a fraction of the danger an ancient warboss poses. Their true threat comes from their ability to unite, organize, and direct orc forces on a scale that younger bosses cannot match. A young warboss might command thousands of orcs. An ancient one commands millions or tens of millions. More importantly, these forces fight with a coordination and purpose that belies the chaotic reputation of orc warfare. They maintain supply lines, establish fallback positions, coordinate multi-front operations, and execute complex strategic plans. This organizational capability transforms the nature of orc threats. A typical orc green tide burns bright but brief, crashing against enemy defenses with tremendous force, but ultimately running out of momentum as internal conflicts and lack of coordination cause the horde to fragment. Forces led by ancient warbosses do not follow this pattern. They sustain themselves over prolonged periods, adapting their tactics based on enemy responses, maintaining pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, and recovering from setbacks that would shatter lesser forces. They fight more like professional armies than mobs, though they retain all the ferocity and aggression of their species. The technological threat posed by forces under ancient warbosses also deserves attention. These bosses attract the finest mechs in orc society. Those rare individuals whose genetic programming allows them to build and maintain advanced technology. Under the direction of an intelligent warboss who understands the importance of logistics and combined arms, these mechs produce weapons and vehicles that rival or exceed Imperial standards. The attack moons created during the War of the Beast, the teleportation systems employed by Gazg'kul's forces, the sophisticated fortifications on Olana, and other orc worlds all demonstrate that ancient warbosses can leverage technology in ways that younger bosses cannot. Their strategic vision allows them to identify and exploit enemy weaknesses with precision. Where a young boss might simply attack the nearest target, an ancient one analyzes the strategic situation and strikes where it will cause maximum disruption. They target supply depots rather than frontline positions. They disrupt communications networks. They identify and eliminate enemy leadership. They force opponents to spread their forces thin by threatening multiple objectives simultaneously. In short, they fight smart wars that maximize their advantages while minimizing their disadvantages. Perhaps most dangerous is their ability to inspire and unite disparate orc forces. The psychic gestalt field, generated by all orcs, grows dramatically stronger around ancient warbosses. This field acts as a beacon, drawing other orcs from across entire sectors. Warbands that might otherwise fight each other unite under the banner of a sufficiently powerful boss. Feral orc tribes that have been isolated for centuries suddenly remember their heritage and join the greater crusade. Even orcs serving other bosses might abandon their current leaders to join what they perceive as a stronger force. This snowball effect means that an ancient warboss's power grows exponentially rather than linearly, each victory attracting more followers who enable further victories. The psychological impact of facing such a foe cannot be understated. Imperial Guard regiments that might stand firm against typical Orc assaults break and run when confronted by a force led by an ancient warboss. The combination of the boss's physical presence, the overwhelming numbers he commands, and the aura of invincibility that surrounds such beings erodes morale in ways that conventional enemies do not. Even Space Marines, who know no fear in the conventional sense, recognize ancient warbosses as threats that require careful planning and overwhelming force to defeat. Their longevity also means they accumulate knowledge that younger bosses lack. An ancient warboss who has fought Space Marines for decades understands their tactics intimately. He knows their strengths and weaknesses, can predict their responses, and has developed counter-strategies for their standard operations. The same applies to Imperial Guard, Astra Militarum, and other factions. This accumulated knowledge makes them increasingly difficult to surprise or outmaneuver, as they have encountered most tricks and tactics multiple times before. The political threat they pose within Orc society itself amplifies all other dangers. When an ancient warboss rises to prominence, other Orc leaders face a choice: submit to his authority or be destroyed. Most choose submission, recognizing that fighting such a powerful boss is futile, and that joining his force offers more opportunities for violence and glory. This creates a cascading effect where multiple Orc empires and tribes consolidate under a single leader, concentrating Orc power in ways that rarely occur otherwise. The result is a unified green tide that can threaten entire sectors, or even, in extreme cases, the galaxy itself. Comparing ancient warbosses to other galactic threats helps contextualize the danger they represent. A demon prince of the Chaos Gods is individually more powerful, but commands limited forces and can be banished back to the warp. A Tyrannid hive fleet is extraordinarily dangerous, but operates according to predictable biological imperatives and can be outmaneuvered through strategic thinking. A Chaos Warmaster leading a Black Crusade is a terrible threat, but faces internal divisions among his followers and limitations on how long he can maintain cohesion. An ancient warboss combines the best aspects of these threats while avoiding many of their limitations. He is individually powerful, commands vast forces, operates with strategic intelligence, and faces minimal internal conflict due to the nature of Orc society. The Imperium's standard response to Orc threats, containment and gradual elimination, proves insufficient against ancient warbosses. By the time Imperial authorities recognize the magnitude of the threat, the boss has often grown too large and gathered too many followers to be easily defeated. Eliminating him requires resources on the scale of full crusades, multiple Space Marine chapters, entire Imperial Guard armies, and the attention of high-ranking Imperial officials. Such resources are rarely available given the Imperium's myriad other threats. The result is that ancient warbosses often operate for years or decades before sufficient force can be marshaled to end them. Moreover, even when defeated, the impact of an ancient warboss persists. The empire he built may fragment, but rarely disappears entirely. The infrastructure he established continues to produce orcs and weapons. The strategic insights he demonstrated get passed on to his successors through orc genetics and cultural memory. Future generations of orcs grow up in the shadow of his legend, inspired to follow in his footsteps and perhaps reach even greater heights. In this way, each ancient warboss who arises makes it slightly more likely that future bosses will follow similar developmental paths, gradually elevating the overall threat level of Orc society across the galaxy. The ultimate threat posed by ancient warbosses is the possibility of a full return to the Krork template. If the right boss survives long enough under the right conditions, if he accumulates enough followers and fights sufficiently challenging enemies, if he reaches the developmental peak his genetics allow, he might not just approach Krork capabilities, but fully embody them. Such a being would possess all the knowledge, technology, and power of the ancient Krork while operating in the modern galaxy, where defenses against such threats have eroded. The result could be catastrophic, on a scale that makes even the War of the Beast look modest by comparison. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps Ordo Xenos Inquisitors awake at night. The idea that somewhere in the galaxy right now, an Orc Warboss is growing, learning, and evolving into the next great threat to mankind's survival. The connection to the Krork. To fully understand what an ancient Warboss can become, we must look backward through time to the very origins of the Orcoid species. The Orcs, as they exist in the 41st millennium, are not natural creatures evolved through conventional processes. They are, in fact, a degraded form of a far more advanced and dangerous species that once fought in the most terrible war the galaxy has ever witnessed. Understanding the connection between modern Orcs and their ancient progenitors, the Krork, provides crucial context for comprehending what happens when an Orc Warboss lives too long and why such beings represent such an existential threat. The story begins over 60 million standard years in the past, during the epoch known in Eldari mythology as the War in Heaven. This was not a conflict between mortal empires, but a clash between godlike powers that reshaped the galaxy itself. On one side stood the Satan, ancient star gods of tremendous power, and their servitor race, the Necrontyr, who had transformed themselves into the immortal mechanical Necrons. Against them stood the Old Ones, a race of reptilian beings whose mastery of the warp and biological engineering was without peer in the galaxy's history. The War in Heaven escalated beyond anything the galaxy had seen before or since. Entire star systems were destroyed as collateral damage. The fabric of reality itself was torn by the psychic energies unleashed during the conflict. The Old Ones, facing potential extinction at the hands of their enemies, turned to their greatest strength: biological engineering. They created servant races, each designed for specific purposes in the war effort. The Eldari ancestors were made as psychic warriors and craftsmen. The Jokero were designed as technology-mimicking savants, and the Krork were engineered as the ultimate soldiers, living weapons capable of matching even the Necrons in their full might. The Krork were not merely soldiers, but warrior scholars, beings who combined tremendous physical capability with sophisticated intelligence. Contemporary accounts, as much as such records can be trusted after 60 million years, describe them as standing nearly 12 meters tall, towering giants, clad in sophisticated armor that would impress even the Mechanicus during the height of the Great Crusade. They were strong enough to tear apart the metal bodies of Necron warriors with their bare hands, tough enough to shrug off weapons that could vaporize lesser beings, and smart enough to employ complex tactics and advanced technology with equal facility. More importantly, the Krork were designed to adapt and evolve in response to their circumstances. The same biological mechanisms that allow modern Orcs to grow larger with combat success were present in amplified form in the Krork. When facing greater challenges, when participating in conflicts of sufficient scale and intensity, individual Krork would develop along predetermined genetic pathways, becoming more intelligent, more powerful, and more capable. This adaptive evolution was a designed feature, allowing the Krork to continually upgrade themselves in response to the threat level they faced. The Old Ones' strategy appeared to work. The psychic servant races they created, particularly the Eldari ancestors and the Krork, proved capable of contending with the Necrons and their Citan masters. Some accounts suggest the Krork were winning their portion of the war, pushing back the Necrons through sheer ferocity and adaptability. But then catastrophe struck from an unexpected direction. The massive amounts of psychic energy being generated by the Old Ones' creations began tearing holes in the fabric of reality, allowing entities from the warp to manifest in real space. The enslavers, terrible warp entities that could dominate minds and reshape flesh, emerged and attacked all sides of the conflict indiscriminately. The War in Heaven ended not with a clear victor, but with mutual devastation. The Old Ones were destroyed, or fled the galaxy. The C'tan were shattered into fragments by their rebelling Necron servants. The Necrons themselves entered stasis for 60 million years, hoping to awaken to a galaxy no longer plagued by the warp entities their war had unleashed. The Aeldari survived and eventually built a galactic empire, but they were forever changed by the horrors they had witnessed, and the Krork, their purpose fulfilled and their creators gone, were left to their own devices in a galaxy littered with ruins and populated by enemies. What happened next remains a matter of scholarly debate, but the outcome is clear. Without the Old Ones to guide them, without enemies powerful enough to trigger their adaptive evolution, without the massive conflicts that kept them operating at peak efficiency, the Krork began to devolve. Generation by generation, they became smaller, less intelligent, less technologically sophisticated. Their language simplified. Their society grew more primitive. Their technology, while still functional due to their racial gestalt field, became cruder and less refined. Over millions of years, the mighty Krork degraded into the orcs that plague the galaxy today. This devolution was not complete, however. The genetic potential of the Krork remains locked within every orc's DNA, waiting for the right circumstances to express itself. The biological mechanisms that allowed Krork to adapt and evolve did not disappear, but merely became dormant, activated only partially under specific conditions. This explains the perpetual growth of orcs, their increasing intelligence with size, and the occasional emergence of prime orcs who demonstrate capabilities far beyond typical greenskins. They are not evolving new traits, but rather reactivating ancient genetic programming that has lain dormant for millions of years. The War of the Beast demonstrated this principle spectacularly. The prime orcs encountered during that conflict were not anomalies, but rather specimens that had developed far enough along the ancient Krork template to approach their ancestors' capabilities. Their tremendous size, sophisticated intelligence, mastery of technology, and ability to speak fluent Gothic were not new developments, but ancient traits reasserting themselves. The fact that 6 such beings arose simultaneously suggests that the right conditions, massive warfare, millions of orcs generating a powerful gestalt field, and enemies that required sophisticated responses to defeat, can trigger this re-evolution in multiple individuals simultaneously. This has profound implications for understanding what happens when an orc warboss lives too long. Each year of survival, each battle won, each challenge overcome, pushes an ancient boss further along the developmental pathway that leads back toward the Krork template. The growth is not random, but directed, following genetic blueprints laid down by the Old Ones' biological engineering 60 million years ago. Given sufficient time and the right circumstances, an orc warboss can effectively become a Krork once more, recovering capabilities that the species lost through long ages of degenerative drift. Gazgkul Thraka's trajectory supports this theory. His name, Mag Uruk Thraka, echoes the ancient phrase used by the beast, suggesting either conscious imitation or genetic memory, expressing itself through cultural means. His rapidly developing intelligence, far exceeding what his physical age should permit, indicates activation of dormant Krork mental capabilities. His ability to speak Gothic, his strategic acumen, and his capacity for long-term planning all point toward recovery of traits that the Krork possessed, but that typical orcs lack. If he continues to survive and grow, if he participates in conflicts large enough to trigger full genetic activation, he might complete the transformation and become something that has not walked the galaxy in earnest for 60 million years. The question that terrifies Imperial strategists is whether this transformation is happening to multiple warbosses simultaneously across the galaxy. The conditions that create ancient warbosses, prolonged large-scale warfare, exist throughout the Imperium and beyond in greater measure than at any time in recent history. The Octarius war pits orcs against Tyranids in a conflict that has raged for decades with no end in sight. Perfect conditions for triggering Krork evolution. The various orc empires scattered across the galaxy Each represent potential incubators for ancient bosses who might, given time, approach Krork status. Even smaller conflicts might produce such specimens if they last long enough and generate sufficient psychic energy. The possibility exists that the orcs are not merely plaguing the galaxy, but are in the process of collectively re-evolving back into their original Krork form. This transformation would not happen overnight or affect all orcs uniformly. Rather, it would manifest first in the most successful war bosses, those who survive longest and fight the hardest, who would serve as pioneers, showing the way for others of their species to follow. Each generation would produce war bosses who develop slightly further than the previous generation, incrementally recovering lost capabilities until eventually the difference between orc and Krork becomes purely semantic. If this process continues unchecked, if the galaxy continues to provide the warfare and challenges that trigger orcoid evolution, the long-term implications are apocalyptic. The Krork were designed to fight the Necrons at their height, to contend with Satan star gods, to operate as peer competitors to the Aeldari Empire in its glory. A galaxy populated by beings with those capabilities, beings who retain the orcs' love of violence and lack of restraint but possess Krork intelligence and technology, would be a galaxy where no other species could hope to compete. Humanity, already stretched to the breaking point by myriad threats, would stand no chance against such a resurgent Krork empire. This is why ancient war bosses must be eliminated quickly and decisively, despite the tremendous cost such operations require. They are not merely dangerous individuals, but potential catalysts for species-wide transformation. Each ancient war boss who survives and thrives makes it more likely that future bosses will follow similar developmental paths. Each demonstration of Krork-like capabilities educates younger orcs about what is possible, inspiring them to push further in their own development. The cultural memory of the species gradually recovers knowledge of what they once were, making it easier for each successive generation to approach that ancient template. The orcs do not remember the Krork consciously. They have no written histories, no academic traditions, no formal preservation of their past. But they remember genetically, through the patterns written into their DNA by the old ones 60 million years ago. And they remember mythologically, through legends of the Brain Boys who supposedly created them, and stories of ancient times when orcs were different, bigger, smarter, more powerful. These memories, vague and distorted though they are, provide a cultural framework that supports rather than hinders their evolutionary regression back toward their origins. The ultimate horror is that this re-evolution might be not merely possible, but inevitable, given sufficient time. The orcs reproduce faster than any other major species, spread more widely, and fight constantly. They are conducting a galaxy-wide evolutionary experiment, testing billions of individuals simultaneously under every possible condition. The laws of probability suggest that some subset of these billions will encounter the exact circumstances necessary to trigger full Krork re-evolution. The only question is when, not if, and whether the galaxy's other powers will recognize and respond to the threat before it becomes unstoppable. When war bosses become too large. While the growth of an orc war boss seems limitless in principle, practical reality imposes constraints that even the most successful bosses cannot fully overcome. There comes a point where size itself becomes a liability, where the advantages of massive bulk are outweighed by the practical difficulties of maintaining such a tremendous frame and operating effectively at colossal scale. Understanding these limitations and how they manifest helps explain why even the most ancient war bosses eventually meet their end, and what happens to orc society when they do. The most obvious limitation is simple physics. While orcoid biology allows them to grow far larger than conventional organisms through the support of their fungal component, they remain bound by fundamental physical laws. A war boss who stands 30 feet tall weighs multiple tons, and this weight must be supported by skeletal structure and muscular systems. Even with the reinforcements provided by fungal tissues and whatever bionic augmentation Painboys can provide, there are practical limits to how large an orc can become before their own weight becomes problematic. Ground pressure becomes an issue at extreme sizes. A being weighing several tons concentrated on relatively small feet, even large orcish feet, exerts tremendous pressure on whatever surface they stand upon. Soft ground becomes nearly impassable, the boss sinking with each step. Wooden floors collapse under their weight. Even reinforced metal flooring can buckle and warp. This limits where such a boss can effectively operate, restricting them to either specially reinforced areas or open ground solid enough to support their mass. Urban combat, naval boarding actions, and fighting inside structures become increasingly difficult or impossible. Mobility decreases with extreme size, while orcs remain dangerous fighters even at colossal scale. They inevitably lose some of the speed and agility that makes smaller specimens so dangerous. Their reflexes remain quick by the standards of such large creatures, but they cannot match the raw speed of a normal-sized orc. This makes them vulnerable to fast-moving enemies who can stay outside their reach while peppering them with weapons fire. Eldar, Tau, and other mobile factions can potentially exploit this weakness, though they must still contend with the boss's tremendous ranged firepower and the hordes of normal-sized orcs that inevitably accompany such leaders. Transport becomes increasingly problematic. A warboss at typical size can ride in battle wagons or board space vessels with minimal difficulty. But an ancient boss approaching or exceeding 30 feet in height cannot fit through standard doors, cannot board standard vehicles, and requires specialized transport arrangements. This makes them less mobile strategically, even if they remain powerful tactically. They cannot easily redeploy to respond to threats in different areas, cannot board enemy vessels during space battles, and generally lose the flexibility that makes orc forces dangerous. Some ancient bosses compensate by rarely leaving their primary stronghold, directing operations remotely, but this limits their personal impact on battles and makes them vulnerable to isolation strategies. Logistics of simply maintaining such a large body strain, even orcish biology, the amount of food required to fuel multiple tons of muscle operating at combat intensity is tremendous. While orcs can photosynthesize to supplement their diet, this only provides baseline energy needs. Active combat requires massive caloric intake, and an ancient boss must consume proportionally more than smaller orcs. This can become problematic during prolonged campaigns where food supplies run low, while orcs are not picky eaters and will consume virtually anything organic. There are limits to how much even a warboss can eat, and those limits become critical at extreme sizes. The mechanics of their armor and weapons also become increasingly problematic. A normal warboss's mega armor is a significant engineering challenge to maintain, requiring constant tinkering by mechs to keep functional. But armor designed for a 30-foot tall orc is effectively a vehicle in its own right, requiring power generation, cooling systems, articulated joints capable of moving tremendous weights, and weapons integration on a scale that strains even orcish engineering capabilities. Breakdowns become more frequent and more catastrophic. Repairs require more time and resources. Eventually, the boss becomes as much a slave to their equipment as a user of it, dependent on their mechs to keep them functional. Combat effectiveness paradoxically begins to decline at extreme sizes, despite absolute power continuing to increase. While an ancient boss of colossal size can destroy more enemies than a smaller one in absolute terms, their enemies learn to adapt. They target the boss with specialized weapons, coordinate their fire, and exploit the inevitable blind spots and vulnerabilities that come with extreme size. Artillery and long-range weapons become more effective against such large targets, as missing is nearly impossible. Concentrated fire from weapons that would merely annoy smaller targets can, when focused properly, exploit gaps in armor or target specific weak points. The boss becomes a bullet magnet, drawing disproportionate attention from enemy forces. More subtly, an ancient boss of extreme size begins to lose connection with their followers. The psychological and psychic bonds that unite orc warbands function best when the boss can physically interact with their troops, leading charges personally and demonstrating their power through direct action. A boss who has grown so large they can no longer move easily among their troops, who must be housed in special structures and transported via specialized equipment, becomes increasingly distant from the boys who should comprise their power base. This distance can erode loyalty over time. As younger orcs rise, who have never personally witnessed the boss's power, or who begin to question whether such an immobile giant truly represents the orcish ideal, the Gestalt psychic field that powers much of orc society can become unstable around bosses of extreme size. The field grows stronger with the boss's increasing power, but it also becomes more turbulent, generating psychic eddies and surges that can be uncomfortable or even dangerous to nearby orcs. Weird boys, the orc psychers who channel this Gestalt energy, may find themselves overwhelmed in the presence of a truly ancient boss, their heads exploding from psychic overload. This can make it difficult for the boss to maintain the full complement of specialists they require, as weird boys and other psychically sensitive orcs avoid getting too close. Perhaps most significantly, the ancient boss becomes increasingly vulnerable to decapitation strikes. While their personal power is tremendous, they cannot be everywhere at once, and their importance to their warband makes them prime targets for enemy special operations. Space Marine strike forces, Aeldari aspect warriors, Tau battlesuits, and other elite units specifically target ancient bosses when possible, recognizing that killing the boss will likely cause the entire orc force to collapse. The boss's size makes them easier to locate and track, and their mobility limitations mean they cannot easily evade assassination attempts. Even if the attackers die in the attempt, which they often do, the strategic impact of forcing the boss to remain defensive can be significant. The psychological burden of leadership at such scale also takes a toll. Though this is harder to quantify, an ancient warboss commands millions of orcs, maintains an empire spanning multiple worlds, and must coordinate operations across vast distances. Even with the increased intelligence that comes with size, this is an enormous cognitive load. The boss must continually assert dominance over ambitious subordinates, make strategic decisions with sector-wide implications, and maintain the momentum that keeps their empire together. The constant pressure can manifest as what orcs call the headaches, periods of irritability and reduced effectiveness that pain boys struggle to treat. Gazikul Thraka himself reportedly suffers from such headaches, requiring Mad Doc Grotznik to perform regular maintenance to keep him functional. These limitations explain why ancient bosses, despite their tremendous personal power, often reach a plateau where they stop growing or begin to decline. The practical difficulties of maintaining their size and position eventually outweigh the advantages additional growth would provide. Some bosses reach this point and remain at roughly the same size for years or decades, focusing on consolidating their empire rather than pursuing additional personal growth. Others continue to grow until the burden becomes unsustainable, their empire collapsing under its own weight, or falling to enemies who exploit their increasing vulnerability. The end typically comes not from natural decline, but from violence. An ancient boss might be killed by a rival who has grown large enough to challenge them. They might fall in battle against a particularly dangerous enemy, their size making them unable to evade a killing blow that a smaller orc might have dodged. They might be eliminated through coordinated enemy action, multiple forces combining to bring down a boss who individually outmatches any of them. However it occurs, the death of an ancient warboss invariably triggers chaos within their empire, as rivals scramble to claim leadership, and the unified front they maintained fragments into competing factions. Yet even in death, an ancient warboss shapes the future. Their genetic material, released through spores after their death, carries the traits they developed during life. Orcs that grow from these spores will have slightly higher potential to reach similar sizes and capabilities. Their legend inspires younger orcs to attempt similar feats, Their empire, even in fragmenting, provides structure and resources that allow the next generation of bosses to develop more quickly. In this way, each ancient warboss serves as a stepping stone toward eventual species-wide recovery of Krork capabilities, their individual limitations ultimately less important than their contribution to the long-term trajectory of Orkoid evolution. The societal impact. The presence of an ancient warboss affects Orc society at every level, from the individual boy to the structure of entire empires. These impacts ripple outward from the boss himself, reshaping the culture, technology, and strategic orientation of greenskin civilization in ways that persist long after the boss's death. Understanding these societal effects provides crucial insight into why ancient warbosses represent such a significant historical force, and why their emergence tends to mark major turning points in galactic history. At the most basic level, an ancient warboss transforms the aspirations of ordinary orcs. Young boys growing up in a tribe led by such a boss see firsthand what an orc can become. They witness a being of tremendous size and power, someone who commands millions and conquers worlds, someone who has achieved what orc mythology says is possible, but that most never witness in reality. This creates a raised ceiling for ambition. Orcs who might have been content to become knobs, instead, aspire to warboss status. Knobs who might have accepted their position instead, scheme to challenge the boss or strike out to build their own empires. The very presence of an ancient boss elevates the competitive stakes throughout the tribe. This cultural shift toward greater ambition manifests in increased violence within Orc society, paradoxically, both strengthening and destabilizing it. The heightened competition means weaker orcs are culled more efficiently, as challenges and fights occur more frequently. This natural selection produces a more capable warrior class, as only the toughest, smartest, or most cunning survive the increased internal conflict. At the same time, the constant jockeying for position can weaken the tribe if not properly managed. A skilled ancient boss channels this competitive energy toward external targets, ensuring that ambitious subordinates direct their violence at enemies rather than each other. But if the boss loses control of this balance, their tribe can tear itself apart. The technological environment changes dramatically under an ancient warboss. These bosses, being more intelligent than their younger counterparts, understand the importance of good equipment and infrastructure. They actively cultivate talented mechs, providing them with resources and protection in exchange for producing higher quality weapons and vehicles. This creates a positive feedback loop. Better equipment makes the tribe more successful, which brings in more resources and attracts more talented mechs, which produces even better equipment. Over time, tribes led by ancient bosses develop technological capabilities significantly exceeding those of typical orc warbands. This technological advancement often includes recovery or reinvention of capabilities lost during the orcs' long devolution from their Krork ancestors. An ancient boss might sponsor a mech who figures out how to build functioning teleportation systems, something most modern orcs cannot accomplish. They might encourage development of sophisticated fortifications rather than crude scrap walls. They might even support construction of spacefaring vessels that approach the quality of Imperial Navy ships rather than the barely functional hulks typical orcs fly. Each such innovation represents partial recovery of ancient knowledge, pushing the entire species incrementally back toward their Krork origins. The strategic culture of a tribe under an ancient boss shifts from purely tactical thinking to genuine strategic planning. Younger orcs live entirely in the present, concerned only with the immediate battle and having little concept of long-term planning. But an ancient boss thinks in terms of campaigns spanning years, infrastructure that will serve multiple generations, and strategic positioning for conflicts that have not yet begun. This strategic orientation filters down through the command structure. Knobs who serve such bosses learn to think beyond the next fight. They begin to understand concepts like logistics, force preservation, and strategic depth. They become, in effect, professional military officers rather than mere brutal thugs. This professionalization of the command structure creates an interesting cultural tension within Orc society. The traditional Orc ethos glorifies direct combat and personal bravery, viewing cunning and planning as un-Orcy behaviors that real greenskins should disdain. But tribes that adopt more sophisticated tactical and strategic approaches tend to be more successful, winning more battles and accumulating more resources. This creates pressure for other Orcs to either adapt similar methods or be destroyed by those who have. Over time, this gradually shifts the entire culture toward accepting, if not celebrating, the kind of cunning leadership that ancient bosses exemplify. The psychic gestalt field that permeates Orc society intensifies dramatically in the presence of an ancient warboss. This field, generated by the collective belief and recognition of all Orcs, grows stronger with the number of greenskins present and the intensity of their shared purpose. An ancient boss commanding millions becomes a focal point for tremendous psychic energy, creating effects that border on the miraculous. Orcish technology works better in their presence. Impossible feats become possible through sheer collective will. The very reality around the boss becomes slightly malleable, bending to conform to Orc expectations. This makes tribes led by ancient bosses more dangerous, not just militarily, but metaphysically, as they can accomplish things that should be impossible simply because they believe they can. The social structure of tribes under ancient bosses tends toward greater complexity and hierarchy than typical Orc society. Most Orc groups have a simple structure: the boss at the top, knobs below him, and boys at the bottom, with various odd boys like mechs and pain boys fitting in as specialists. But an empire led by an ancient boss requires more sophisticated organization. Subordinate warbosses command sectors or worlds, each with their own knobs and boys. These subordinates form a kind of officer class, meeting regularly with the chief boss to coordinate strategy. Mechs and other specialists organize into guilds or collectives to share knowledge and resources. Administrative systems emerge to track inventory, manage populations, and coordinate logistics. The result resembles a real government far more than typical Orc society's organized anarchy. This increased organizational sophistication allows ancient bosses to build empires that persist beyond their immediate presence. Unlike typical Orc territories that fragment immediately when the boss dies or moves on, empires built by ancient bosses can maintain coherence for extended periods even after their founder's death. The infrastructure, chain of command, and cultural momentum they establish continue to function under new leadership. This is why the great Orc empires of the galaxy, Octarius, Sharadan, Bork, and others, have persisted for centuries or millennia, despite numerous leadership changes. The ancient bosses who founded them created systems robust enough to survive their absence. The cultural mythology of Orc society evolves under the influence of ancient bosses. These beings become legendary figures, their deeds celebrated in stories and songs that Orcs pass down through their communities. The legends often grow in the telling, with the boss's size, cunning, and achievements becoming ever more exaggerated. But rather than being mere entertainment, these stories serve an important function. They establish templates for what Orcs can aspire to, providing behavioral models that younger Orcs unconsciously emulate. Each new generation grows up hearing about the great bosses of the past and striving to match their achievements, creating a cultural impetus toward producing more ancient bosses in the future. Interestingly, ancient bosses also affect how Orcs interact with other species. A young warboss views non-Orcs purely as targets or obstacles, things to be killed or subjugated with minimal differentiation between species. But ancient bosses develop a more nuanced understanding. They learn to recognize the different strengths and weaknesses of various species, to exploit their psychological and cultural tendencies, even to manipulate them through deception and misdirection. Some ancient bosses have been known to temporarily ally with non-orc forces when it serves their strategic objectives, something younger orcs would never consider. This pragmatic approach to interspecies relations makes tribes led by ancient bosses more unpredictable and dangerous, as they are willing to employ strategies that other orcs would reject as un-orky. The long-term impact of ancient bosses on orc evolution cannot be overstated. Each boss who successfully develops toward Krork capabilities serves as a proof of concept, demonstrating that such development is possible and providing a template others can follow. Their genetic material, released as spores after death, carries the traits they developed, seeding countless worlds with orcs who have slightly higher potential. Their legends inspire younger orcs to pursue similar paths. Their innovations in technology, tactics, and strategy get incorporated into broader orc culture. In these ways, each ancient boss incrementally raises the baseline capability of the entire species, gradually pushing all orcs back toward their Krork origins, whether consciously intended or not. Conclusion: an eternal cycle. As we reach the end of this exploration into what happens when an orc war boss lives too long, certain truths become inescapable. The transformation that overtakes these ancient bosses is not merely a curiosity of orcoid biology, but a fundamental threat to the stability of the galaxy. Each boss who survives long enough to reach this stage represents a potential catalyst for catastrophic change, a living example of what the greenskin species is capable of becoming under the right circumstances. Understanding this threat, in all its biological, psychological, and societal dimensions, is essential for comprehending one of the most significant challenges facing the Imperium, and indeed all civilized species, in the 41st millennium and beyond. The journey from boy to ancient warboss follows a predictable path, though few orcs survive to complete it. Initial growth driven by combat success, accumulation of victories, and respect leading to increased size, assumption of leadership through domination of rivals, consolidation of power and expansion of territory, development of strategic thinking and organizational capabilities, and finally, for those rare individuals who survive long enough, the approach toward or achievement of prime orc, or even Krork level capabilities. Each stage represents both an increase in personal power and a qualitative shift in the nature of the threat the boss poses. The biological mechanisms driving this transformation reveal the sophisticated engineering that went into the orc's creation. Their perpetual growth, linked to combat success and peer recognition, ensures natural selection for the most capable warriors. Their regenerative abilities make them extraordinarily difficult to kill. Their photosynthetic capabilities reduce logistical requirements. Their fungal component provides structural support and systemic redundancy that allows them to grow far beyond the limits of conventional organisms. And underlying all of this is genetic programming designed by the Old Ones to produce warriors capable of fighting the most dangerous enemies the ancient galaxy could manifest. The psychological evolution accompanying physical growth proves equally significant. Ancient bosses develop genuine intelligence, strategic thinking comparable to the finest human commanders, adaptability born from decades of accumulated experience, and eventually, wisdom about their own nature and purpose. This mental development transforms them from simple brutes into cunning warlords capable of building empires and coordinating operations on a galactic scale. It is perhaps this aspect more than sheer physical power that makes them so dangerous, as intelligence combined with orcish strength and resilience produces a threat that is difficult to counter through conventional means. The historical examples examined, from Urlak Urg to the Beast to Kazkul Thraka, demonstrate that ancient warbosses are not rare anomalies, but recurring phenomena. The conditions that produce them, large-scale warfare, abundant enemies, and insufficient intervention to eliminate them early, exist throughout the galaxy and throughout history. Each historical boss provides lessons about how such beings arise, how they operate, and what is required to defeat them. Yet these lessons appear to be continually forgotten or ignored, with each new generation of Imperial leaders underestimating the Orc threat until it becomes impossible to ignore. The connection to the ancient Krork provides perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire phenomenon. The Orcs are not evolving into something new, but rather re-evolving back into something old, something that once fought as peers to the mightiest empires the galaxy has ever known. The genetic potential for full Krork capabilities exists within every Orc, waiting for the right circumstances to express itself. Ancient war bosses who live long enough and fight hard enough begin to unlock this potential, approaching or achieving capabilities their species possessed 60 million years ago. If this process continues unchecked, if more and more bosses complete this transformation, the galaxy could eventually face a resurgent Krork empire that no existing power could hope to defeat. The practical limitations that eventually constrain even the most ancient bosses, mobility issues, logistical challenges, vulnerability to assassination, and the psychological burden of leadership at massive scale, provide some comfort that these beings are not truly invulnerable. Yet these limitations often manifest too late, after the boss has already built an empire and shaped their society in ways that persist beyond their death. Moreover, each ancient boss who emerges pushes the species incrementally further back toward their Krork origins, meaning future bosses will likely face fewer limitations than their predecessors. The societal impact of ancient bosses extends far beyond their immediate military threat. They transform Orc culture, elevating expectations for what Orcs can achieve, improving technological capabilities, professionalizing military leadership, strengthening the psychic gestalt field, and creating infrastructure that allows empires to persist beyond individual leaders. These changes ripple through Orc society for generations, gradually raising the baseline capability of the entire species. In this way, each ancient boss serves as a stepping stone toward eventual species-wide recovery of Krork capabilities, their individual lifespans less important than their cumulative impact on Orcoid evolution. The Imperium's response to the threat of ancient war bosses has proven insufficient despite the lessons of history. Organizations like the Ordo Xenos and Deathwatch were specifically established to prevent another beast from arising, yet they are perpetually stretched thin across a galaxy beset by threats on all sides. By the time an ancient boss is recognized as requiring urgent attention, they have often grown too large and accumulated too many followers to be easily eliminated. The resources required to end such threats, multiple Space Marine chapters, entire Imperial Guard armies, focused inquisitorial attention, are rarely available given the Imperium's myriad other concerns. The result is a reactive rather than proactive approach, containing rather than eliminating threats until they become uncontainable. Looking to the future, the trajectory is concerning. The galaxy in the late 41st millennium is more violent than perhaps any time since the war in heaven itself. The Cicatrix Maledictum has split the Imperium in half. The Tyranids assault from multiple directions. Chaos forces emerge from the warp in ever greater numbers. Necrons awaken from millions of years of slumber. Tau expansion continues unabated. And amidst all this chaos, the Orcs fight constantly, everywhere, growing and learning and evolving with each passing year. The conditions for producing ancient war bosses exist across the entire galaxy simultaneously, suggesting that multiple such bosses may be developing at this very moment, each one approaching the threshold where they become unstoppable. Gazkul Thraka represents the most immediate and obvious example, but he is almost certainly not alone. In the Octarius War, Orc forces have been fighting Tyranids for decades in exactly the kind of sustained, large-scale conflict that triggers Orcoid evolution. In the various Orc empires scattered across the galaxy, local bosses have been consolidating power and growing larger for generations. In countless smaller conflicts throughout Imperial and Xeno-controlled space, young warbosses are winning battles and earning the respect that fuels their growth. Some subset of these will survive long enough to become genuine threats, ancient bosses who approach or exceed prime orc capabilities. The nightmare scenario that keeps Inquisitors awake is not a single ancient warboss emerging, but multiple such beings appearing simultaneously across the galaxy, as happened during the War of the Beast. If several bosses reach prime orc status at roughly the same time, if they manage to coordinate their efforts even loosely, if they unite enough of the scattered orc tribes under their combined leadership, the resulting green tide could be impossible to stop. The Imperium barely survived the War of the Beast when it was relatively unified and fresh from the Great Crusade. The current Imperium, divided, stretched thin, and beset by countless other threats, might not survive a similar conflict. Yet there is also a strange poetry to the threat ancient war bosses represent. They embody the eternal cycle of war that defines the grim darkness of the far future. They rise from humble beginnings through strength and cunning. They grow powerful enough to threaten empires. They leave lasting legacies that inspire future generations. And eventually, they fall, whether to rivals, enemies, or the limitations of their own biology, only for the cycle to begin again, with the next ambitious boy who survives long enough to grow large and dangerous. This endless repetition, this eternal struggle for dominance through violence, is perhaps the most orcish thing about them, the perfect embodiment of a species engineered for eternal war. So we return to our original question: what happens when an orc warboss lives too long? The answer is complex but clear. Physically, they grow to tremendous size, becoming living siege engines capable of destroying armies single-handedly. Psychologically, they develop genuine intelligence and strategic acumen that belies the brutish reputation of their species. Societally, they transform orc culture and build empires that can persist for generations. Evolutionarily, they approach or achieve the capabilities of their ancient Krork ancestors, potentially presaging a species-wide return to that terrible template. And ultimately, they represent one of the most significant, ongoing threats to the stability of the galaxy, a threat that grows with each passing year as more bosses survive, grow, and evolve toward their full potential. If you found this deep dive into orc biology and the terrifying implications of ancient war bosses interesting, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Understanding the lore behind these green-skinned terrors helps contextualize just how dangerous they truly are, and why the Imperium treats them as an existential threat, rather than merely a nuisance. And if you have thoughts on which ancient warboss you'd like to see covered in more detail, or other aspects of orc lore you'd like explored, leave a comment below. The galaxy is vast and full of stories waiting to be told. And the tale of the orcs is one that spans 60 million years, from the war in heaven to the present day, and may continue for millions more. Until next time, stay vigilant, for somewhere in the darkness, an orc warboss is growing larger, smarter, and more dangerous with each passing day.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.